Hello, existentialists. Welcome to this lecture on the tragic sense of life by Miguel de Unamuno. Last week, we covered some applications of existentialism in contemporary Latinx and Chicanx thought, before going further back, the earlier 20th century, into the roots of Spanish existentialism in Ortega y Gasset. Today, we're going further back in Spanish existentialist traditions, to who we might consider the Kierkegaard of the Spaniards, Unamuno, whose years were 1864 to 1936, is influenced by several new currents of thought, psychoanalysis, Marxism, and existentialism. He was primarily, like Nietzsche, a classicist, a professor of Greek, and an essayist and novelist. He was indeed especially influenced by Soren Kierkegaard and a committed Catholic thinker. Born in 1864 in Bilbao, Portugal, he attended the University of Madrid in 1880, receiving his doctorate by 1884. He's part of the very next generation after Nietzsche and so becomes influenced by Nietzsche's thought, although virulently rejects much of it. He lived most of his life in Salamanca, except for periods of exile and deportation. And in 1896-7, he experienced a personal religious crisis that caused his distrust of scientific positivism. By 1914, he became the rector of the University of Salamanca, and yet from 1924 to the end of his life, he suffered political persecution, job loss. His post eventually reinstated, but lost again, and he died shortly after under house arrest. From these pictures, you can see he must have been an incredibly charismatic individual. Reading The Tragic Sense of Life, I suspect that he was influenced by Maurice Maeterlinck, whose perspective seems germane to his, although more mystical and less Catholic. And he was also popular at the time. Of course, the internet is full with meme quotes deriving from him, such as "life is doubt," and "faith without doubt is nothing but death." "Knowledge for the sake of knowledge, truth for truth's sake, that is inhuman." And only he who attempts the absurd is capable of achieving the impossible. We're going to look today at the first 3 chapters of his book, The Tragic Sense of Life, which are the man of flesh and bone, the starting point, and the hunger of immortality. And you can see at this point, the task becomes that of defining the essence of Catholicism, followed by the dissolution of rationalism, all the main problems of 20th century existentialism, reinstating throughout a Catholic existential ethics, and dealing by the end at the practical problems of European modernity, and proposing a new role for the figure of Don Quixote and the Spanish literary and existential legacy in what he calls the contemporary European tragicomedy. By the end of the book, Don Quixote becomes the hero of Spanish thought and the key to unlocking quixotic existence beyond the impasses of religion in a transcendental economy. Unamuno's writing is incredibly lucid, entertaining, concise, and demonstrative. Rather than give a traditional lecture on the first 3 chapters, what I'll do here is mostly read or perform what I find to be the most significant quotes for existential philosophy, with only minimal digressions here and there to explain their relevance and give some essential background. The chapter, The Man of Flesh and Bone, begins, "I am a man, no other man do I deem a stranger. To me, the adjective humanus is no less suspect than its abstract substantive humanitas, humanity." Note here already the suspicion against the very idea of a humanism. How can we speak of being with others mid-sign as universal humanity without trespassing on the other, the individual, who in sympathy is never wholly a stranger? The man of flesh and bone, the man who is born, suffers and dies, above all who dies, the man who eats and drinks and plays and sleeps and thinks and wills, the man who is seen and heard, the brother, the real brother. This man is not known to us, but is, like us, a man of flesh and bone. Man has been defined by the zoon politikon, the political animal in Aristotle, the social contractor by Rousseau, Homo economicus by Marxism, and the Homo sapien of Linnaeus. That is merely an idea man, a no man. Philosophy, if it is honest, will note that concrete man, this man of flesh and bone, is at once the subject and the supreme object of all philosophy, whether certain self-styled philosophers like it or not. And here we find Kierkegaard's emphasis on existential individuality. On the nature of the human being, it behooves us to say before all that philosophy lies closer to poetry than to science. Here, a powerful declaration and even a confession. For philosophy answers to our need of forming a complete and unitary conception of the world and of life. And life, like everything effective, has its roots in subconsciousness, perhaps in unconsciousness. As the German classicists, romantics, and idealists used to say, nature is only the unconscious poetry of the spirit. Man is said to be a reasoning animal. I do not know why he has not been defined as an affective or feeling animal. here making Unamuno a precursor of affect theory. Perhaps that which differentiates him from other animals is feeling rather than reason. More often, I have seen a cat reason than laugh or weep. Perhaps it weeps or laughs inwardly, but then perhaps also inwardly the crab resolves equations of the second degree. I think this is true. I just got my first kitten. I've observed that 80% of her consciousness is calculative. When we look to the man of flesh and bone, the nature of the human being, we find is a long history of great exemplars, men and women of the first degree, or what Unamuno calls a litany of concrete men. That is concrete here, no matter how abstract their thought. Their lives of flesh and bone always being larger than the sum total of their philosophy. Such a man was Immanuel Kant, who destroyed traditional metaphysics in order to preserve Lutheran faith. The God of theology and metaphysics, i.e. the God of ontotheology, is a projection of human infinitude. It never separates, however, from flesh and bone, that is, from finitude. Kant's ultimate obsession, like any man, was individual destiny and the immortality of the soul. This is true despite the strictures on the critique of pure reason, on the operation of dialectical reason, the inability to know metaphysically God, the soul, immortality, freedom. Ultimately, Kant's obsession was like that of any other man. And in the critique of practical reason, God is proven based on the immortal soul. Hegel made famous his aphorism that all the rational is real and all the real rational, a thought he derived from ancient Stoicism. There are many of us who, unconvinced by Hegel, continue to believe that the really real, is irrational, and that reason builds upon irrationalities. Unamuno, making no secret of his predilection for the Epicurean metaphysical position, and probably Lucretius's on the nature of things, in contrast to the Stoic. William James, the American pragmatist, Joseph Butler, Spinoza, the greatest of Jewish pantheists and rationalists, all argued for a concrete personal immortality of the soul, because they had to, not because of rational faith in God. On the great Spinoza, Unamuno writes, "To be a man is to be something concrete, unitary, substantive. It is to be a thing, a res." Now we know what another man, the man Benedict Spinoza, that Portuguese Jew, i.e. Portuguese like Unamuno, who was born and lived in Holland in the middle of the 17th century, wrote about the nature of things. Spinoza's pantheism, according to which God equals nature, posits life as a fundamental conatus. Everything, insofar as it is in itself, endeavors to persist in its own being, the desire for self-preservation being the essence of life. This means that your essence, reader, mine, that of the man Spinoza, that of the man Butler, of the man Kant, and every man who is a man, is nothing but the endeavor, the effort which he makes to continue to be a man, not to die. That is to say that you, I, and Spinoza wish never to die, and that this longing of ours never to die is our actual essence. Notice here how far Unamuno is from any sort of naive position that existence precedes essence, that we decide essence for ourselves. Rather, our actual essence is here rooted in Spinozan pantheism. We are beings of conatus. Our essence is the will to life and self-preservation. Within this doctrine, however, Spinoza, the man of flesh and bone, lacked faith in his own personal immortality. He had what Unamuno calls a God ache. His philosophical system of transcendence within immanence, God within nature, and all the attributes and the modes, leading the soul through ethics in the final analysis, a reunion with God and personal immortality, the very working out for Spinoza of this lack of faith, a necessary philosophical quest, if life is to preserve its very essence or being, conatus. At the far end from Spinozan rationalism, there is modern positivism, which also thinks of the human being as a thing, but in a radically different sense. Unamuno, most of the facts labeled as such by positivism are really only fragments of facts. In fact, the psychology of positivism and its morphing into logical positivism in the early 20th century had a harmful effect on the development of psychology, or even positivistic, logical, scholastic men meddling in literature. I will not say philosophers meddling in poetry, because poet and philosopher are twin brothers, even if they are not one and the same. Inside every true philosopher, we find a poet, and inside every true poet, we find a philosopher, at least since the dawn of modernity. This positivism business being carried into psychological analysis and into the novel and drama is just distasteful. We cannot so reify our ephemeral states of consciousness without those states themselves disappearing. Reminding us of Ortega and Gasset's project of overcoming idealism, Unamuno as well comes out against fixed subjective idealism. to being the origin of German idealism, the first to subvert comprehensively Kant's distinction of the phenomenal and noumenal worlds. We don't have time here to go on a long digression on Fichte and his role in German idealism between Kant, Hegel, Schelling, and others. Suffice to say, for Fichte, the principle of identity, or I equals I, is the very formula of the universe of the subject and the object, perfect relation of identity, equality, and harmony. And so, in Fichte's subjective idealism, according to Unamuno, to ask a man about his I is like asking him about his body. And note that in speaking of the I speak of the concrete personal I, not the I of Fichte, but of Fichte himself, the man Fichte. We're clearly more interested here in Fichte himself than in his I as God. And this man Fichte is a principle of unity, firstly in space, thanks to the body, and next in action and intention, and also a principle of continuity in time. Without entering upon an unprofitable discussion as to whether I am or I am not he who I was 20 years ago, it appears to me indisputable that he who I am today derives by a continuous series of states of consciousness from him who was in my body 20 years ago. So within this concrete and personal I, we live in memory and by memory, and our spiritual life is at bottom simply the effort of our memory to persist, transform itself into hope, and the effort of our past to transform itself into our future. Also, from within this personal concrete I, dissociation and depersonalization, wanting to be someone else, is absurd. On a certain occasion, a friend remarked to Unamuno that I should like to be so-and-so, naming someone, and I said, "That is what I shall never be able to understand, that one should want to be someone else. I understand that one should wish to have what someone else has, his wealth or his knowledge, but to be someone else, that is a thing I cannot comprehend." Everyone defends his own personality and only consents to a change in his mode of thinking or of feeling insofar as this change is able to enter into the unity of his spirit and become involved as part of his continuity. That is, insofar as this change can harmonize and integrate itself with all the rest of his mode of being, thinking, and feeling, and can at the same time knit itself with his memories. Pathological conditions and even madness are next discussed as consisting in a breach in such continuity. On the links between personal, concrete continuity and collective, historical continuity, the common theme is overcoming self-destructive tendencies. Everything in me that conspires to break the unity and continuity in my life conspires to destroy me and consequently to destroy itself. Every individual in a people who conspires to break the spiritual unity and continuity of that people tends to destroy it and to destroy himself as part of that people. Because for me, becoming other than I am, the breaking of the unity and continuity of my life is to cease to be who I am. That is to say, it is simply to cease to be, and that, no, anything rather than that. And here Kant agrees when he thinks of our fellow men not as means, but as ends in themselves, either choosing from a good will to conspire together in a kingdom of ends, or suffering the consequences of individual and collective self-destruction. Unamuno concurs man is an end, not a means. All civilization addresses itself to man, to each I. The world is made for consciousness, for each consciousness. History belongs to those who grow and learn its lessons. In an anonymous quote, a human soul is worth all the universe. I suppose here we must speak of an idealism and anthropocentrism still in Unamuno. On consciousness and finality, or teleology, final goals in nature, Unamuno's perspective is still very traditional. The world is for consciousness. Self-awareness is nature's inbuilt teleology, or in Aristotle, an entelecheia. Although here with a twist, for rather this for the notion of finality, and feeling rather than notion, this teleological feeling is born only where there is consciousness. And so consciousness and the self-positing of finality are fundamentally the same thing. He writes beautifully, if the sun possessed consciousness, it would think, no doubt, that it lived in order to give light to the worlds. It would also, and above all, think that the worlds existed in order that it, the sun, might give them light and enjoy itself in giving them light, and so live as the sun. And the sun would here think well. And it is quite comical that Unamuno's very next move involves a condemnation of Nietzsche. If consciousness is, as some inhuman thinkers said, nothing more than a flash of light between two eternities of darkness, then there is nothing more execrable than existence. From this malicious and ungrounded attack on Nietzsche, I can only conclude that Unamuno has only really read, formulating this thought, an early essay of Nietzsche on truth and lies in the extramoral sense, which contains a Carl Sagan-like sense of the futility and insignificance of human beings' invention of knowledge on a planet doomed to death in cosmic timescales. It does not seem that Unamuno has engaged with Nietzsche's own doctrines of consciousness, its history and development and function, as well as limits in texts like The Gay Science or other books from the Free Spirit trilogy. Quite ironically and paradoxically, his beautiful thought of the sun that possesses consciousness and thinks that the worlds exist in order that it may give them light and enjoy itself in doing so, precisely how Nietzsche's greatest text, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, begins, Zarathustra's Hymn to the Sun. It was indeed an era where what little was known about Nietzsche provoked intense reactions. Let's forgive Unamuno here for his misreadings. On Heraclitean contradiction, strife, and the disunity of opposites, he asks, contradiction? To be sure, the contradiction of my heart that says yes and my head that says no. Of course there's contradiction. Again, this is exactly what Nietzsche aimed to point out in his understanding of consciousness versus the body and the will to power. Unamuno, these questions are framed more in a Kierkegaardian Christian religious register. Who does not recollect those words of the gospel, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief? We saw the same gospel citation as well in Gianni Vattimo's Postmodern Christianity, and he said, I believe that I believe. Contradiction, of course, since we only live in and by contradictions, since life is tragedy and tragedy is perpetual struggle, without victory or hope of victory, life is contradiction. Far in the course, we've encountered existential ambiguity a great deal, never such a fervent homily to contradiction itself. Against strictly rational men, Unamuno writes, the philosopher is not a man, he is anything but a philosopher. He is above all a pedant, and a pedant is a caricature of a man. Cultivation of any branch of science, chemistry, physics, geometry, philology, may be a work of differentiated specialization, and thus so only within the very narrow limits and restrictions. But philosophy, like poetry, is a work of integration and synthesis, or else it is merely pseudo-philosophical erudition. You can see in Unamuno here, like in Nietzsche, the intense philosophical consciousness of the classical philologist, who understands that even philosophy is a work of poetry, like scripture, or any other text of the human spirit. Unamuno's epistemic doctrines we hear, knowledge for the sake of knowledge is, say what you will, nothing but a dismal begging of the question. Coming out against the Aristotelian tradition, theoretical contemplation is a good in itself. Just as a scientific fact has its finality in the rest of knowledge, so the philosophy that we would make our own has also its extrinsic object. It refers to our whole destiny, to our attitude in the face of life and the universe. And the most tragic problem of philosophy is thus to reconcile intellectual necessities with the necessities of the heart and the will. Our supreme preoccupations are not merely rational, but must involve the heart, that is destiny and feeling. Remember, man is a feeling animal as much, if not more, than a rational one. Without the feeling element, we simply cannot become who we are. In a culture exclusively devoted to rationality over the passions and the feelings in their irrationality, produces nothing but clever yet effectively very stupid people. Like in Stoicism in Unamuno, misery is not to be shunned but contains its peculiar wisdom. The pedant who beheld Solon weeping for the death of a son said to him, "Why do you weep thus if weeping avails nothing?" And Solon, leader of the Athenians and philosopher in his own right, answered, "Precisely for that reason I weep, because it does not avail." Unamuno notes beautifully that the chiefest sanctity of a temple is that it is a place to which men go to weep in common. A miserere or misericordia sung in common by a multitude tormented by destiny has as much value as a philosophy. And like in Albert Camus' later novel, The Plague, it is not enough to cure the plague, we must learn to weep for it. Yes, we must learn to weep, and perhaps that is the greatest reason. Why? Asks Solon. And now we learn what the tragic sense of life is really all about. It is something which, for lack of a better name, we call the tragic sense of life, which carries with it a whole conception of life itself and of the universe, a whole philosophy more or less formulated, more or less conscious. Among men of flesh and bone, there have been typical examples of those who possess wholeheartedly the tragic sense of life. I recall now Marcus Aurelius, St. Augustine, Pascal, Rousseau, Leopardi, Vigny, Kleist, and Kierkegaard, here leaving unmentioned those authors with which I am not familiar. All men burdened with wisdom rather than knowledge. How Unamuno could emphasize this as the core of his philosophy and simply despise Nietzsche, whose philosophy from its earliest period in the birth of tragedy and philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks was rooted in this same sentiment, and this same philosophy is beyond me. And so concludes chapter 1. More quotable internet memes for a little intermission. Only in solitude do we find ourselves finding ourselves. We find in ourselves brothers in solitude. A man does not die of love, or his liver, or even of old age. He dies of being a man. And killing time is perhaps the essence of comedy, just as the essence of tragedy is killing eternity. And lastly, completely inverting Aristotle's metaphysics here, fear is the beginning of wisdom. At the outset of his chapter, the starting point, we hear consciousness is a disease. You guessed it, Nietzsche said it first. Both probably get it here from the essayist Michel de Montaigne. May not disease itself possibly be the essential condition of that which we call progress, and progress itself a disease? And of course, Unamuno, being a Catholic thinker, the starting point ends up being the mythical tragedy of paradise. Therein dwelt our first parents in a state of perfect health and perfect innocence, and Yahweh gave them to eat of the tree of life and created all things for them. But he commanded them not to taste of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But they, tempted by the serpent, Christ's type of prudence, here a reference to his ordeals in the desert, and overcoming of the serpent or the devil through the wisdom of love, tasted of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and became subject to all diseases and to death, which is their crown and consummation, and to labor and to progress. This is one version of our origin story, the Judeo-Christian one. Unamuno asks, do you want another one? Very well then, according to this Darwinian account, man is, strictly speaking, merely a species of gorilla, orangutan, chimpanzee, or the like, more or less hydrocephalus. Once upon a time, an anthropoid monkey had a diseased offspring, diseased from the strictly animal or zoological point of view, really diseased, and this disease, although a source of weakness, resulted in a positive gain in the struggle for survival. Eventually, the only vertical mammal at last succeeded in standing erect, man. Upright, opposable-thumbed, tool-fashioning, speaking, dead-referencing monkeys. That's what we are, according to this origin story. We try to sort out these two origin stories and which one is correct. No, there's no point in bothering. They're both perspectives and they both have their truth. We cannot help but wish to sort out these origin stories and others. And this is because we are driven, as Aristotle says at the start of his metaphysics, by the desire to know. Where Aristotle concurs with the Judeo-Christian tradition itself, which curiosity or the desire for knowledge led our first mother to sin, and is again the origin of knowledge. It is necessary to distinguish here between Aristotle and Christianity. The former seeks love of knowledge itself for itself. The latter is eager to taste the fruit of the tree of knowledge, discover the necessity of knowledge, but only for the sake of living. Unamuno prefers this lineage. The origin of knowledge is for living and surviving. And unbeknownst to him, sounding a lot like Nietzsche, man has debated at length and will continue to debate at length, the world having been assigned as a theater for his debates concerning the origin of knowledge. But apart from the question as to what the real truth about this origin may be, it is certainly an ascertained fact that in the apparential order of things in the life of beings who are endowed with a certain more or less cloudy faculty of knowing and perceiving, or who, at any rate, appear to act as if they were so endowed, knowledge is exhibited to us as bound up with the necessity of living and of procuring the wherewithal to maintain life. Unamuno's existential episteme here is thus, in some sense, a pragmatism, but still closely tied to religious traditions. Knowledge is employed in the service of the necessity of life, and primarily in the service of the instinct of personal preservation. And here, society, civilization, and collective reason are the social products. For man does not live alone. He is not an isolated individual, but a member of society. There is not a little truth in the saying that the individual, like the atom, is an abstraction. Yes, the atom apart from the universe is as much an abstraction as the universe apart from the atom. And if the individual maintains its existence by the instinct of self-preservation, society owes its being and maintenance to the individual's instinct of perpetuation. And from this instinct, or rather society, springs reason. Reason, or that which we call reason, reflex and reflective knowledge, as the distinguishing mark of man is a social product. Aristotle or the Stoics might disagree here, point out that the world is rational on the basis and from nature, and living in accordance with nature. However, recall that Unamuno expects the world is fundamentally irrational. That is part of its charm as well as deep religious meaning. In any case, reason owes its origin ultimately perhaps to language. Having reduced reason to a social product, Unamuno next addresses the objection, his philosophy of the man of flesh and bone creating the sensible world yet loving the ideal one is merely a metaphor flying in the face of the findings of modern biology. Perhaps all our religious systems are in the end merely spiritual parasites, and the literal language of natural science will triumph. This does not worry Unamuno in the slightest. For again, like Nietzsche, science and reason themselves can only function by means of metaphors. At bottom, the social sense, the creaturely nature of love, the creation of language, of reason, and the ideal worlds of philosophy are nothing other than what we call fancy or imagination. Reason and science themselves are grounded in their origin in fancy. However, he rejects the modern philosophical worry that imagination is merely one faculty among others, to wit, one that fashions images capriciously. As he answers, what is caprice? Notes that the senses and all of reason are capricious as well, and fallible, lest their findings would not be subject to ongoing revision. And the greatest thing we can imagine from out of the conatus, or will to life, living and to self-preservation, is still immortality. We shall have to inquire, what is this inner social faculty, the imagination which personalizes everything and which, employed in the service of the instinct of perpetuation, reveals to us God and the immortality of the soul. These doctrines of God and the soul themselves also being social products. We must ask here, is Unamuno in fact leading us to a vindication of Catholic irrationalism? Before we can answer that question, we must ask, why does man philosophize? That is to ask, why does he investigate the first causes and ultimate ends of things? Why does he seek disinterested truth? For to say that all men have a natural tendency to know is true, but wherefore, what, and why? What is the object or goal of making philosophy, in thinking it, and expounding it to one's fellows? What does the philosopher seek in it and with it? Truth for its own sake? The truths of nature, being, or God, that we may subject our conduct to them and determine our spiritual attitude towards life and the universe conformably to that? No, not exactly, although these can be admirable goals. Yet Unamuno insists that it is out of the desire for immortality, that is the will to life, that we philosophize, and that it is the wholeness of man that philosophizes, not just the I. Philosophy is a product of the humanity of each philosopher, and each philosopher is a man of flesh and bone who addresses himself to men of flesh and bone like himself. Here returning to the outset of the first chapter. And let him do what he will, he philosophizes, not with reason only, but also with the will, with the feelings, with the flesh and with the bones, with the whole soul and the whole body. It is the man that philosophizes. And he does not wish to use the word I here in connection with philosophizing. For example, the I think of Descartes, for example, the I think, therefore I am, or cogito ergo sum of Descartes, lest such an impersonal I should be understood in place of the man Descartes. The I that philosophizes properly is the one who suffers from toothache and finds life insupportable if death is the annihilation of his personal consciousness. This I should not be confounded with that other counterfeit I, the theoretical I, which from Descartes through Kant to Fichte was smuggled into philosophy, nor yet with the unique or the theoretical in Max Stirner, a contemporary of Marx, who deepened the philosophy of the ego considerably and is still well worth reading today, and who is often considered a stepping stone between Marx and Feuerbach, again demonstrating his philological instinct, likely in the background noting that ancient Greek philosophy barely utilizes the I or the ego. Unamuno avers it is better to say we, understanding, however, the we who are circumscribed in space and time. That is the historical we. When we look at the quest for philosophy and truth in light of this historical we and its continuities, personal and collective, we must note, as of course Nietzsche also did, that knowledge for the sake of knowledge, truth for truth's sake, is inhuman. Only that Nietzsche gets called an inhuman philosopher, yet his philosophy agrees in every point with Unamuno's that we've studied so far. Every point minus the Catholicism that we've studied so far. Now sounding like Heidegger, but minus the Aristotelian bent, The philosopher philosophizes for something more than for the sake of philosophizing. The philosopher is a man before he is a philosopher. He must needs live before he can philosophize, and in fact he philosophizes in order to live. Here Unamuno seems an inheritor of William Dilthey's hermeneutics of life, and a precursor of life philosophy, thinkers like Max Scheler or Karl Jaspers. Furthermore, we philosophize in order to resign ourselves to things, to seek finality in them, or to forget griefs or for amusement. Philosophy is fun and can have a major role to play in healing human misery, as all the Hellenistic schools of philosophy knew very well. Again, demonstrating his sure philological instinct, Unamuno even goes so far as to note that philosophy is a kind of spiritual pimping. And he quotes from Xenophon's Memorabilia the charming encounter of Socrates and the courtesan Theodote, and Socrates instructs her on the wiles she ought to use in order to lure lovers to her house, and wherein Theodote is so impressed that she begs Socrates to act as her companion in the hunt for friends, her sumpheritis in Greek, in a word, her pimp. I also taught ancient philosophy this semester. I have an 8-minute sum up of this charming dialogue on YouTube you can check out. So I was pretty impressed to read in Unamuno that philosophy is wont, in fact not infrequently, to convert itself into a kind of art of spiritual pimping, sometimes also into an opiate for lulling sorrows to sleep. And nothing is wrong with these avenues of philosophy. Rather, they essentially cement its usefulness for life. As preserving and enhancing living, philosophy also seeks the goal of life, its final good, happiness, or equanimity. Whence do I come, and whence comes the world in which and by which I live? Whither do I go, and whither goes everything that environs me? What does it all mean? Such are the questions that man asks as soon as he frees himself from the brutalizing necessity of laboring for his material sustenance. And if we look closely, we shall see that beneath these questions lies the wish to know not so much the why as the wherefore, not so much the cause as the end. Cicero's definition of philosophy is well known here: the knowledge of things divine and human, and of the causes in which these things are contained, is supposed to be the goal of philosophy, getting back to the beginning, so that we can more truly realize the end. But in reality, for Unamuno, the causes or origins, aetions, are actually the goals. Now, this sounds a lot like the existential realization that we are thrown into the world. We'll never, in fact, be able to get back to the first principles and causes, except ideologically or dogmatically speaking, and as part of a particular school. That is, as a purely theoretical activity which is, in the end, useful only for life. Specifically for the concrete personal life, creates its goals for itself, discovers its origins only in its ends. And here we begin to hear intoned glimmers of Unamuno's Catholicity. Why do I wish to know whence I come and whither I go, whence comes and whither goes that environs me? What is the meaning of it all? Here raising the question to a more meta-epistemic level. I do not wish to die utterly, and I wish to know whether I am to die or not definitively. If I do not die, what is my destiny? And if I die, then nothing has any meaning for me. That the world is irrational is not an argument against Christian theology or soteriology. In fact, it fits perfectly into that overall perspective of this world as an experiment and a test, leading perhaps to our deepest existential desire, which is to realize our destiny in immortality. And here the goal is indeed prior to and transcending of the origin, just as, according to the Judeo-Christian picture, God transcends and creates nature. What is a bit puzzling here is how Unamuno frames it: Catholicity or nihilism. Like any good Catholic, he sees these as the only alternatives, for which there are to wit 3 solutions. 1, I know that I shall die utterly, and then irremediable despair. 2, I know that I shall not die utterly, and then resignation. Or 3, I cannot know either one or the other, and then resignation in despair, or despair in resignation, a desperate resignation, or a resigned despair, and hence conflict. How masterfully he repurposes Kierkegaard here. On life versus knowledge, we hear that living is one thing and knowing another. Perhaps there is no opposition between the two. Perhaps we may even say that everything vital is anti-rational, not merely irrational, and that everything rational is anti-vital. If this is the basis of the tragic sense of life, it also underlines the Augustinian priority of faith over reason, and in fact constitutes a Christian existential disavowal of reason, a personal quest for the nativity, the passion of martyrdom on the altars of reason, and the resurrection. Descartes' errors here for Unamuno is cogito, which leaves out flesh and bone. he chose knowledge so as to evade the tragic sense of life, his rationality becoming equally machinic to his animals. Simply flipping the cart on his head, Unamuno proclaims sum ergo cogito. I am, therefore I think. Being is prior, although not everything that is thinks. And is not consciousness of thinking above all consciousness of being? What a simple and elegant reversal of the Cartesian in favor of the existential position. Transitioning now to the discussion of the existential meaning of personal immortality, he keenly suspects that the longing not to die, the hunger for personal immortality, the effort or conatus whereby we tend to persist indefinitely in our own being, the very essence in Spinoza, is the deeply personal, effective basis of all knowledge and the personal starting point of all philosophy. And so philosophy begins less in wonder that things are in the world or that the world is at all, and more in the cross of mortality and the desire for personal immortality, i.e. the origin of philosophy is the very notion of the human soul, which can never be answered decisively or sorted out in a system of reason, but always remains a hope and a quest. All the rest is either to deceive oneself or wish to deceive others, and to wish to deceive others in order to deceive oneself. And this personal, effective starting point of all philosophy and all religion is the tragic sense of life. Let us now proceed to consider this. Transitioning now to the third chapter, the hunger for immortality. Here's another little smattering of memeable Unamuno quotes. A lot of good arguments are spoiled by some fool who knows what he is talking about. The satisfied, the happy, do not live. They fall asleep in habit, near neighbor to annihilation. And lastly, fascism is cured by reading, and racism is cured by traveling. What a charming, brilliant, and witty philosopher we have here. Let us pause now to consider, he begins the third chapter, that this yearning, this immortal yearning for immortality, was indeed the animating drive of Socrates and Plato, the Gnostics, and even Spinoza, besides himself, and many others besides. It is impossible for us, in effect, to conceive of ourselves as not existing, as no effort is capable of enabling consciousness to realize absolute unconsciousness, its own annihilation. This sounds like an inversion of the Epicurean position. We should not fear death, since when I am there, death is not, and when death is present, I am nothing. In fact, according to Unamuno, we can't even conceive ourselves as not existing. We are incapable of even formulating the very idea of death, except in an abstract or horror fiction mode. Life, its essence as immortality, our primary experience. So contra Epicurus, we should not fear death because it cannot exist for us. Try, reader, to imagine to yourself when you are wide awake the condition of your soul when you are in a deep sleep. Try to fill your consciousness with a representation of no consciousness, and you will see the impossibility of it. The effort to comprehend it causes the most tormenting dizziness. We cannot conceive of ourselves as not existing. Again, the real scula and charybdis in which human life is enmeshed is Catholicity or nihilism, all or nothing, sounding here a bit like Pascal's wager, minus any element of doubt. Ratiocination. Yes, it's true that even the vast immensity of the universe seems tiny, and it's also true that my wanting to be myself does not preclude wanting to be others. We also find in ourselves a desire to merge into the totality of things visible and invisible, into illimitable space, and to prolong ourselves into the infinite of time. Our desire for personal immortality does not preclude a desire for a Taoist merging with the all, for a Hinduistic identity of Atman, the world's soul, and Brahman, the world's spirit or God. For not to be all and forever is as if not to be. At the very least, we hope to be our whole selves and to be so forever. And here we cannot distinguish between being the whole of myself and being everyone else. Reason of the heart that reason knows not, always either all or nothing. From here we get the wisdom of Shakespeare's Hamlet, to be or not to be. The speech of Marcius in Coriolanus. He wants nothing of a god but eternity. Eternity, eternity, that is the supreme desire. No doubt something like this Catholicity also animated Nietzsche at the end of the third part of Zarathustra in the Seven Seals and his songs to eternity, eternity. Thirst for eternity is the essential desire of the soul and is what is called love among men. And whosoever loves another wishes to eternalize himself in him. Nothing is real that is not eternal, and even the greatest poetic recognitions of transiency and finitude, such as the ancient Greek poet Pindar's saying, man is but the dream of a shadow. Or in the plays of Calderon, life is but a dream. And Shakespeare's we are such things as dreams are made of. All are spoken from and point to the yearning for eternity. The vanity of the passing world and eternal love are the two fundamental and heart-penetrating notes of true poetry. Everything passes, such is the refrain of those who have drunk lips to the spring of the fountain of life, and of those who have tasted of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And here, almost heretically, we must acknowledge, along with Unamuno, this desire for eternity is also a desire to be God. To be forever, to be without ending, thirst of being more, hunger of God, thirst of love, eternalizing and eternal, to be forever, to be God. Here our inordinate conatus is checked. For ye shall be as gods, is what the serpent said to the first pair of lovers in Genesis. Was the serpent perhaps an advocatus diaboli, and not per se the devil itself? And did he speak in advocacy of the history of this life and the hope in Christ? Paul wrote in the Corinthians, if in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men most miserable. Stunning revelation of the existential roots of primordial Christianity in Paul. All religion has sprung historically from the cult of the dead, that is to say, from the cult of immortality. According to Spinoza, the free man thinks of nothing less than of death. Rather, he cultivates his active passions, immanence in God as nature. Here we must have the courage to think death itself. The free man is also a dead man, free from the impulses of life, for want of love, the slave of his liberty, the spider who weaves the chrysalis of his philosophic system, simply because it expels doubts and provides comforts and consolations. We cannot, in the end, evade the thought of death, even if it is unthinkable. Rather, this thought that I must die and the enigma of what will come after death is the very palpitation of my consciousness. When I contemplate the green serenity of the fields or look into the depths of clear eyes through which shine a fellow soul, my consciousness dilates. I feel the diastole of the soul and am bathed in the flood of the life that flows about me, and I believe in my future. But instantly the voice of mystery whispers to me, thou shalt cease to be. The angel of death touches me with his wing, and the systole of the soul floods the depths of my spirit with the blood of divinity. Unthinkable as it is, death, the very origin of our religious consciousness, the blood of a god in us. It has been said 1,000 times and in 1,000 books that ancestor worship is for the most part the source of primitive religions, and it may be strictly said that what most distinguishes man from the other animals is that in one form or another he guards his death and does not give it over to the neglect of teeming Mother Earth. He is an animal that guards its dead. From what does he thus guard them? Our wretched consciousness shrinks from its own annihilation, and just as an animal spirit newly severed from the womb of the world finds itself confronted with the world and knows itself distinct from it, so consciousness must needs desire to possess another life than that of the world itself. And so the earth would run the risk of becoming a vast cemetery before the dead themselves should die again. A stunning revelation that insofar as we are beings essentially oriented by the yearning from immortality, perhaps by the immortality of the soul itself, we live in an earth that is ever overpopulated with ghosts and specters. Since our ancestors as well, we never allowed to die. To meditate upon mortality indeed induces in us a sense of anguish, but fortifies us in the end. In a marvelous thought experiment, Unamuno writes, retire, reader, into yourself, and imagine a slow dissolution of yourself, the light dimming about you, all things becoming dumb and soundless, enveloping you in silence, the objects that you handle crumbling away between your hands, the ground slipping from under your feet, your very memory vanishing as if in a swoon, everything melting away from you into nothingness, and you yourself also melting away, the very consciousness of nothingness, merely as the phantom harborage of a shadow not even remaining to you. What a powerful meditation on death as dissolution, to remedy, to consider our mortal destiny without flinching, to fasten our gaze upon the gaze of the Sphinx. For only thus is the malevolence of the spell of nothingness discharmed, disenchanted, or disarmed. Against the joie de vivre philosophy of the bon vivant, the whatever will be, live this day as if it is your last, or carpe diem philosophy, seize the day, What Unamuno recommends is that we cultivate a consciousness and a capacity for the liberating death. Our hunger for God, our thirst for immortality, for survival, will always stifle in us the pitiful enjoyment of the life that passes and abides not. It is the frenzied love of life, the love that would have life be unending, that most often urges us to long for death. This is a lesson that Socrates, with his will for life and welcoming of death, knew very well. Why then should it not end forthwith, so that no new consciousness doomed to suffer the tormenting illusion of a transient and apparential existence may come into being? Is the pessimistic wisdom of Silenus in fact correct? Is our best remedy to die? Is death, at least the liberating death, realized in the solace of immortal consciousness, humanity's greatest good? This problem is tragic, and eternal and glorious is the risk. The more we seek escape from it, the ordinary everyday sense of life and not the tragic sense of life, the more it thrusts itself upon us. 24 centuries ago, in his dialogue on the immortality of the soul, the Phaedo, serene Plato, but was he serene? Spoke of the uncertainty of our dream of being immortal, and of the risk that the dream might be vain. From his own soul there escaped this profound cry, glorious is the risk, kalos gar o kindunos. Magnificent, beautiful is the wager that we are able to run of our souls, never dying. This sentence being itself the germ of Pascal's famous wager. I do admire Unamuno as a philologist here, since he clearly notes that these words are Plato's own, even though put into the mouthpiece of Socrates. Or from what else we know of Socrates, we're simply unsure if he was ever capable or would have ever desired to utter these words. Making a brief foray into the area of ethics, the yearning and wager of immortality, that is life in the face of death, immediately imposes on us a correction of our usual moral values. If such immortality is real in the individual, we should not sacrifice ourselves, not even to our children, which means here not becoming slaves, merely defer our immortality and their existence for the sake of the image of mortality produced by offspring and the generations. We sacrifice ourselves to them because they are ours, part and prolongations of ourselves. They in turn sacrifice themselves to their children and these children to theirs, and so it goes on without end, a sterile sacrifice by which nobody profits. Of course, Unamuno here is pre-climate change. Probably facing the global crises we now have, might advocate a little bit of sacrifice for succeeding generations. Metaphysical principle is the same, however. Came into the world to create myself and what is to become of all ourselves. And here he rails against another common principle, characteristic of a naivete without knowledge. Live for the true, the good, and the beautiful. I think positive. We shall see presently the supreme vanity and the supreme insincerity of this hypocritical attitude. The unity, integrity, and wholeness of the immortal soul is even discussed in Unamuno in terms of the that art thou philosophy of the Upanishads. Justifying my mention of it earlier in this lecture, the old Brahmin instructs the young son to look into a cup of water in which salt is dissolved, and to answer where the Brahmin is in that. To which the son replies, everywhere. To which the Brahmin replies, that art thou, or Atman is Brahman, or soul and immortal essence, suffused throughout the entire universe. And Unamuno concurs, yes, I am that, if that is I and all is mine, and mine the totality of things. For as mine, I love the all, and I love my neighbor because he lives in me and is part of my consciousness, because he is like me, because he is mine. This might be a somewhat extreme formulation of this same principle of mineness that we found in Ortega and Gasset and Gemeinigkeit in Heidegger. More on that soon. The danger here is, of course, solipsism and the notion of the infinite microcosm, that is the monad of Leibniz infinitely mirroring the whole of the cosmos, at least insofar as its perceptions are clear and distinct, of course. This cosmic consciousness is not the end-all and be-all and cannot be assured in Unamuno. It is certainly a powerful impetus in the yearning search for immortality. And again, it illustrates the influence of the philosophy of idealism, particularly more esoteric or cosmic dimensions of Maurice Maeterlinck. More to his own point, something like this same cosmic consciousness he finds in St. Paul on his trip to the Athenians. It is related in the book of the Acts of Apostle how wherever Paul went, the Jews moved with envy and were stirred up to persecute him. He arrived at Athens, however, the noble city of intellectuals, over which brooded the sublime spirit of Plato, the Plato of the gloriousness of the risk of immortality. At first the Athenians responded warmly. He seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, and they took him and brought him into the Areopagus, saying, May we know what this new doctrine is, whereof thou speakest? For thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. We would know therefore what these things mean. Classic Athenian wonder and intellectual curiosity. But in the end, they were too much connoisseurs of decadence and new ideas, and when they heard of the resurrection, they laughed these newfangled doctrines into irrelevance. Go thy way, for this time, when I have a convenient season, I will call for you. For Unamuno, this fascinating historical incident reveals the intolerance of Greek intellectualism, indeed of Western intellectualism as a whole. Whatever of truth there may have been in Paul's discourse, and even if there were none, it is certain that this admirable account plainly shows how far Attic tolerance goes and where the patience of the intellectuals ends. They all listen to you, as they all perhaps listened to the Catholic Unamuno, calmly and smilingly, and at times they encourage you, saying, That's strange, or how smart he is. But that's suggestive, or how fine, or pity that a thing so beautiful should not be true. Or this makes one think. But as soon as you speak to them of the resurrection and life after death, they lose their patience and cut short your remarks and exclaim, Enough of this, we will talk about this another day. And it is about this, my poor Athenians, my intolerant intellectuals, it's about this that I'm going to talk to you here. Unamuno here explicitly styling himself as a new St. Paul in the arena of Western intellectual history dating back to Aristotle. The knowledge of death, his confrontation with the riddle of the Sphinx, still be converted into the spectacle and artfulness that the Athenian intellectuals can tolerate. Before this terrible mystery of immortality, face to face with the Sphinx, man adopts different attitudes and seeks in various ways to console himself for ever having been born. And now it occurs to him to take it up as a diversion, and he says to himself, with Ernest Renan, an important French Orientalist and Semitic scholar who is still very worth reading today, this universe is a spectacle that God presents to himself, and that it behooves us to carry out the intentions of the great stage manager and contribute to make the spectacle the most brilliant and the most varied that it may be. Thus they have turned our very existence, the Sphinx of death, soul, and immortality, into a religion of art, a cure for metaphysical evil, and invented the meaningless phrase of arts for art's sake to justify it. And of course, this suffices no one. An aesthetic theodicy is not the only satisfactory one. In Unamuno, unlike in the early Nietzsche, no matter how gloriously we parse the religion of positivism or analytic philosophy into a new religion of art, an artfulness or analytic skillfulness, it still totters as a house of cards, a rational construction, at the brink of chaos, and whose foundations is death and the immortal soul. And here, Unamuno introduces the theme of anxiety in relation to mortality. Of course, again, making a most trenchant use of Kierkegaard's abyssal angst and leap of faith. When doubt invades us, as it invariably does in the modern world, and clouds our faith in the immortality of the soul, a vigorous and painful impulse is given to the anxiety to perpetuate our name and fame, grasp at least a shadow of immortality. In other words, anxiety is part and parcel of the conatus or drive and will of life to be, its function in the economy of the emotional life being to goad us towards immortality and even freedom. And hence this tremendous struggle to singularize ourselves, to survive in some way in the memory of others and in posterity. It is this struggle 1,000 times more terrible than the struggle for life that gives its tone, color, and character to our society, in which the medieval faith in the immortal soul is passing away. This is again a stunning recognition that though we may be living in a secularizing post-death of God era, in which religion, theology, Christianity no longer unifies all the worlds of meaning of the various European historical peoples, nevertheless our way of life and the very passions of our soul are still informed by the same Christian anxiety that goes back through Kierkegaard to Pascal and even further. The final death throes of the very idea and hope in an immortal soul, each one nevertheless seeks to affirm himself, if only in appearances, i.e. the fundamental essence of life, its conatus, to always be what it will be, what it was, is, and will be, is never fully vanquished, and thus anxiety over mortality continues unabated. It is in Unamuno, like in other existentialists we've studied, the great educative passion. and standing in the way and interrupting profound existential anxiety is vanity, as discussed in Rousseau's Emile. For when we are vain, even when we are in a position to discover the truth, we rarely take an interest in it. For each one knows well that his system is not better founded than the others. This is the specter of philosophical relativism, correlative completeness of all the competing philosophical worldviews. Hence all can be equally well justified, and in the end come down to a matter of irresolvable antinomy. Each philosopher ends up supporting the world system he supports less because it is true than because it is his. There is not a single one of them who, if he came to know the true and the false, would not prefer the falsehood that he has found to the truth discovered by another. What a devastating critique of the modern philosophers. The essential thing is to think differently from others. With believers, he is an atheist, and with atheists, he would be a believer. In this way, truth itself becomes a game. Nevertheless, how much substantial truth there is in these gloomy confessions of this man of painful sincerity, Rousseau. Another impediment along the path to immortal anxiety is envy, which, like vanity, blocks the road. A tremendous passion is this longing that our memory may be rescued, if it is possible, from the oblivion which overtakes others. From this passion for immortalization for eternity springs envy, which is the cause, according to the biblical narrative, of the crime with which human history opened, the murder of Abel by his brother Cain. It was not a struggle for bread, it was a struggle to survive in God, in the divine memory, in God's honor. And envy is 1,000 times more terrible than hunger, for it is spiritual hunger. It is a profoundly indigent neediness for absolute being, truth, God, in a world in which very often we cannot even satisfy the first conditions of our spiritual health. If what we call the problem of life, the problem of bread, were once and for all solved, the earth would be turned into hell anyway by the emergence in more violent form of the struggle for ideological survival. I find this to be a bit extreme, but I get Unamuno's point. Even if we solve the pressing practical, ecological, and political needs of our world, we'll have come no closer to having answered the metaphysical needs of every one of us. Beyond vanity and envy, pride and depression are further roadblocks. And yet, as they all exhaust themselves, anguish at last leads us to consolation. This thirst for eternal life is appeased by many, especially by the simple, at the fountain of religious faith. But to drink of this is not given to all. The institutions whose primordial end is to protect this faith in the personal immortality of the soul is Catholicism. Catholicism has sought to rationalize this faith by converting religion into theology, by offering a philosophy and a philosophy of the 13th century as a basis for vital belief. And so ends Unamuno's introduction to the work as a whole, and the beginning of his chapter on the essence of Catholicism. So in conclusion, what we have surveyed here, only in its introductory gestures, is Miguel de Unamuno and his Catholic existentialism. Again, what delightful pictures of such a delightful looking human being. Stay tuned next for a more in-depth discussion of the first two introductions to Heidegger's Being and Time. See you then.